You think you can just call the cops on someone's land? I muttered under my breath as I stepped onto the damp soil of my orchard, the earthy smell of freshly turned dirt mixing with the sharp tang of pine from the surrounding trees. Morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting a patchwork of gold and green across the rows of apple trees I had nurtured for years. My hands were still damp from watering the saplings, and the cool metal of the watering can sent a shiver up my arm. A few birds chirped overhead, seemingly oblivious to the tension building below, their melodies clashing with the distant, high-pitched wail of a police siren that suddenly echoed down the narrow country lane. I froze, my heart skipping a beat, as a dark blue SUV rolled into the driveway. The crunch of gravel under tires made every nerve in my body tense, and I could smell the faint aroma of exhaust mingling with the wet soil. Out of the vehicle stepped Margaret Thompson, my neighbor and the self-appointed HOA enforcer everyone around here dreaded, her pristine white blouse stiff with authority, her heels clicking sharply on the gravel as if she owned the very ground beneath my feet. She held up her phone like a weapon, calling out to the approaching officers, her voice slicing through the morning air, accusing me of trespassing and operating a farm in violation of HOA rules. The words hit me like an unexpected frost, freezing the energy in my chest for a moment as I watched two patrol cars come to a halt at the edge of the orchard, their red and blue lights painting the leaves in unnatural hues. Sweat prickled at my temples despite the crisp spring air, and I felt the taste of tension like metal on my tongue. The officers approached cautiously, scanning the rows of trees, glancing at the neat little wooden signs marking each plot, and then back at Margaret, whose gaze was a mix of indignation and triumph. I stepped forward, feeling the familiar texture of the soil under my boots, grounding me, reminding me that every inch of this land had my fingerprints, my sweat, my care etched into it. I could hear my own voice trembling slightly as I asked them to wait, to listen, to understand, but Margaret interrupted with her clipped, haughty laughter, the sound as sharp and brittle as cracking ice. I could see the shimmer of her diamond earrings catching the sunlight, almost mocking me, a symbol of the entitlement that had been suffocating this community for far too long. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead and carrying the distant scent of freshly baked bread from a neighbor's house, incongruously domestic against the drama unfolding. My mind raced, retracing the steps that had led me here, the deeds, the property lines meticulously recorded in legal binders, the surveys and maps that proved without a doubt that the ground beneath Margaret's feet, the very lot the HOA clubhouse sat on, belonged to me. As I crouched to touch the rough bark of a young apple tree, the coolness and rough texture grounded me, reminded me of the patience it had taken to cultivate this orchard, and of the quiet strength I carried, the kind that couldn't be intimidated by a shouting neighbor or flashing lights. My gaze flicked between the approaching officers and Margaret's confident posture, and I felt a surge of determination, a pulse that thumped in sync with the crunch of gravel under their boots. The orchard smelled of earth and potential, of apples yet to ripen, and in that moment, every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant siren, the murmurs of birds, seemed amplified, each one a reminder that this was my land, my sanctuary, and that the fight for it was only just beginning. The tension in the air felt thick as I stepped closer to the officers, my boots sinking slightly into the soft soil, leaving behind small imprints that marked my claim. The morning sun warmed my back, and a light breeze carried the faint scent of honey from the wildflowers lining the orchard perimeter. I could hear the low hum of bees among the blossoms, a comforting contrast to the raised voices of Margaret and the officers, their words bouncing off the trunks of the apple trees. I held my hands up calmly, trying to project confidence even though my heart raced like the wings of the birds overhead. I started explaining the history of the land, how every tree had been planted with care, each one catalogued in journals and photographs dating back years. Margaret interjected, her voice dripping with disbelief, insisting that the area was restricted by the HOA covenants, her words sharp and rehearsed. I could see the small tremor in her hand as she gestured toward the patrol car, a subtle crack in the armor she had built around her authority. I took a deep breath and began to outline the legal documents I had meticulously filed, deeds and property maps that demonstrated beyond any doubt that I owned not only the orchard but the parcel that the HOA building occupied. The officers listened attentively, jotting down notes, occasionally exchanging glances, their body language shifting from skepticism to cautious acknowledgement. I could hear the crunch of gravel as Margaret moved back, momentarily unsettled by the clarity of my explanation and the confidence in my tone. The sunlight caught the edges of my papers, making the ink shimmer as I flipped through them, pointing out boundaries, easements, and recorded surveys. The wind rustled the leaves above, carrying with it the mingled scents of earth, grass, and faint asphalt from the distant road, grounding me and reinforcing my connection to the land. I noticed the subtle change in the officers' posture, their hands relaxing from the defensive positions they had initially taken, and I could feel a quiet vindication rising within me. Margaret's expression hardened, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt as she glanced at the meticulously organized documents, the careful photographs of boundary markers, and the surveyor's notes pinned to the edges of my notebook. My voice remained steady as I elaborated on the zoning details and previous correspondences, each point reinforcing my rightful ownership, each fact a brick in the wall of credibility I was building. The early morning sounds, the distant crow of a rooster, the gentle buzz of insects, and the soft rustling of leaves, blended seamlessly with my measured explanation, creating a rhythm that calmed my own nerves while slowly dismantling the assumed authority Margaret had wielded so confidently. As I concluded my presentation, I saw a momentary shift in the dynamics. The officers nodded slightly, the tension in the air softened, and Margaret's posture stiffened, a silent acknowledgement that the narrative she had counted on had been turned on its head. I took a step back, letting the weight of the orchard and the documents speak for themselves, the cool spring air brushing against my skin, the sunlight illuminating every detail of the trees, the soil, and the neatly marked boundaries, a visual testament to the truth of my ownership and the resilience of patience and preparation against unchecked assumption. As the morning sun climbed higher, warming the orchard and highlighting the gentle curve of each branch, I felt a sense of control returning to my chest. Margaret shifted uneasily, her polished shoes making slight indentations in the gravel as she tried to maintain her composure, but the confidence she projected began to crack under the weight of the documents I had presented. I walked slowly along the boundary line, the dry soil crunching underfoot, and traced the edge of my property with a gloved hand, feeling the rough texture of the wooden stakes that marked my land. The officers followed quietly, flipping through the folders and maps I had handed them, their expressions moving from polite skepticism to measured recognition. I could smell the faint aroma of the flowering apple blossoms mixing with the morning dew, a scent that somehow grounded me as I continued to speak, describing each parcel, each recorded easement, and the historical surveys that proved my ownership. Margaret raised her voice again, attempting to dispute my claims, but it lacked the force it had held earlier. It sounded rehearsed, like words she had practiced in front of a mirror, and not the confident assertion of truth. I noticed her hand tighten around her phone, her knuckles pale against the smooth plastic, and I realized that her carefully constructed authority had no foundation against the facts I laid out so clearly. The light shifted through the trees, casting long shadows across the orchard rows, and I felt a strange calm as I continued to explain, pointing to the precise measurements, the notarized documents, and the historical records that had taken me years to compile. The officers nodded intermittently, occasionally exchanging glances, signaling a subtle shift in their perception, and I felt the orchard respond to me in a way only a dedicated caretaker could understand, the branches seeming to sway in acknowledgement of the truth being revealed. Margaret stepped back, her expression flickering between disbelief and reluctant acceptance, and I realized that the balance had begun to tip. The distant hum of a tractor from a neighboring farm mixed with the soft rustle of leaves, creating a soundscape that reminded me of why I had poured so much of myself into this land. Every tree, every stake, every carefully planted sapling had been a deliberate act of ownership, a testament to patience, dedication, and attention to detail. I stopped at the corner of the property, lifted a small notebook from my pocket, and flipped through the pages, letting the weight of each documented survey, each recorded note, speak for itself. The cool breeze carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass, and I realized that the morning had transformed from confrontation into recognition. Margaret's confident stance had diminished, her gestures smaller, more uncertain, while the officer's focus on the records and evidence had solidified the reality of my claim. I exhaled slowly, tasting the crisp spring air, and felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the unspoken acknowledgement that truth and preparation had begun to prevail over assumption and pretense. And in that quiet yet charged morning, the orchard, the trees, and the earth beneath my feet seemed to bear witness to the restoration of order and rightful authority. The morning continued to unfold with a sense of quiet authority settling over the orchard, the sunlight now warmer, casting long shadows that stretched between the trees and highlighted the gentle undulations of the land. I walked along the edge of the property, the grass soft beneath my boots and the scent of freshly turned soil rising with each step, reminding me of the countless hours spent tending to this space. Margaret stood a few feet away, her posture rigid. Yet I noticed the subtle loosening in her shoulders as the weight of undeniable facts began to press down. The officers lingered near the middle row of apple trees, their attention divided between the meticulous records I had presented and the physical markers on the land that corroborated every detail I had explained. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves as the wind shifted, carrying with it a mixture of floral sweetness from nearby wildflowers and the earthy aroma of damp soil. It was a rhythm of life that contrasted sharply with the tension that had dominated the previous hour, but it also underscored the permanence of what I was defending. I knelt by a young apple tree, running my fingers over the coarse bark and feeling the subtle grooves that had formed as it grew, a tactile reminder of time, care, and patience invested in this land. Margaret attempted another interruption, her voice sharp and rehearsed, yet it faltered against the calm confidence that had begun to radiate from me. I stood tall, lifting a folder and showing her detailed surveys, maps, and historical records that not only delineated the orchard but also included the parcel that her HOA headquarters occupied. The sunlight caught the edges of the papers, making the ink glisten, and I could sense the shift in the air as reality started to outweigh assumption. The officers nodded quietly, occasionally exchanging glances that conveyed acknowledgement without needing words, and the orchard seemed to respond as well, the gentle sway of branches and the soft hum of insects blending into a subtle affirmation of my explanation. I took a deliberate breath, inhaling the sweet, earthy aroma of the orchard mixed with the faint scent of asphalt from the nearby lane, and felt the growing clarity in the space around me. Margaret's gaze wavered, and she glanced down at the stakes marking the property lines, a silent recognition of boundaries she had previously ignored. I continued to outline the history of the land, the careful planning and cultivation, and the legal steps taken to ensure protection, each word punctuated by the sounds of life in the orchard. A bird call here, a leaf brushing against bark. There, a distant tractor hum. My voice remained measured, each sentence a steady rhythm, building a narrative that was impossible to refute. The tension that had been thick in the air began to lift, replaced by an almost imperceptible deference, and I felt the satisfaction that comes from clarity and preparation finally prevailing. Walking toward the center of the orchard, I paused to look around at the rows of trees, the stakes, and the fertile soil, appreciating the full scope of what I had cultivated and the recognition that it demanded, and I knew that today, the balance had shifted, truth had asserted itself, and the orchard stood not only as a testament to my hard work but also as a quiet monument to rightful ownership and enduring patience. The light shifted subtly as late morning edged into noon, and I walked along the row of apple trees with a quiet assurance, feeling the rough bark under my fingertips and the gentle warmth of the sun on my face. The orchard smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of blossoms, a combination that had become synonymous with the years I had invested in this land. Margaret stood near the edge of the property, her posture tense and arms folded, yet her eyes betrayed a growing awareness that the narrative she had relied upon was unraveling. The officers lingered respectfully, scanning the documents I had laid out and occasionally nodding toward the survey markers and boundary stakes that aligned perfectly with my claims. I could hear the subtle chorus of the orchard, the faint buzz of insects, the occasional rustle of leaves in the soft wind, and a distant crow from the neighboring farm, each sound amplifying the sense of calm that came from standing firmly in the truth. I picked up a small clipboard, leafing through photographs and annotated maps, each one capturing a meticulous detail, and I pointed to a corner of the property where Margaret's HOA building sat squarely on my land, her expression flickering between disbelief and reluctant acceptance. The sunlight glimmered on the pages, the ink crisp and clear, and I could feel a quiet satisfaction rise within me as I outlined the chain of legal documentation, zoning, information, and historical records that supported every statement. My voice was steady and measured, harmonizing with the gentle hum of the orchard as I elaborated on each point, reinforcing the undeniable reality of my ownership with facts and tangible evidence. Margaret shifted again, her shoes pressing into the gravel, the sound crisp and echoing faintly, a reminder of the contrast between assumption and verifiable truth. I traced the boundary lines physically with my hand, feeling the texture of the stakes, the grooves in the bark, and the undulations of the soil, grounding myself in the physicality of my claim as I continued speaking. The officers nodded silently, their body language indicating growing comprehension, and I could sense the orchard itself embracing the shift, every tree, every leaf, every stone seemingly bearing witness to the legitimacy of my words. The air carried the scents of wildflowers and freshly mowed grass, intermingling with the warm earth, creating an atmosphere of affirmation and quiet triumph. Margaret glanced down at the stakes again, her previous certainty now replaced with hesitation, and I recognized in that subtle change the power of preparation, patience, and steadfast commitment. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool spring air fill my lungs, and allowed a small smile to surface as I observed the subtle shift in dynamics. The officer's stance relaxed, Margaret's confidence wavered, and the orchard, alive with natural sound and scent, reinforced the reality that truth, carefully documented and patiently presented, had begun to reclaim its rightful place. A testament to the diligence and care that had defined my relationship with this land over the years. The afternoon sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows between the apple trees, highlighting the intricate patterns of branches and leaves that had grown over the years with careful attention and consistent care. I walked slowly along the fence line, feeling the subtle texture of the wooden posts beneath my fingertips and the uneven ground beneath my boots, a reminder of the natural contours of the land that I had come to know intimately. The scent of damp soil mingled with the faint aroma of flowering blossoms, and a light breeze carried the distant hum of bees as they moved among the trees. Margaret shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her earlier confidence waning as she glanced repeatedly at the folders of legal documents I had laid out on the picnic table nearby, each sheet meticulously labeled and cross-referenced with maps, surveys, and notarized deeds. The officers remained attentive, their eyes scanning both the documentation and the stakes marking the property lines, the subtle nods between them signaling a growing acknowledgement of the facts I presented. I could hear the soft rustle of leaves overhead, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the distant rumble of a tractor from the neighboring farm, sounds that created a steady rhythm that contrasted with the tension of moments before, grounding the entire scene in reality. I pointed to a section of the orchard where the property line curved around a small grove, explaining how the historical surveys had consistently recognized my ownership of this parcel, and Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her posture stiff as she processed the information. I walked further into the orchard, brushing my gloved hand against the rough bark of a mature apple tree, feeling the years of growth and careful maintenance that had gone into cultivating each branch, each fruit-bearing limb, and I explained to the officers the significance of these markers in establishing continuous possession. The sunlight shifted, glinting off the papers and the metallic edges of the stakes, making the evidence tangible, almost luminous in its clarity. Margaret's attempts to interrupt became less frequent, her voice subdued, and I noticed the subtle shift in her expression, a mixture of frustration and reluctant acceptance that she could no longer argue against the well-documented truth. I inhaled deeply, the spring air fresh and invigorating, carrying the earthy aroma of the orchard and the faint sweetness of the blossoms, and I felt a growing sense of satisfaction as the narrative I had carefully constructed unfolded before the officers and Margaret alike. Every detail, the placement of stakes, the precise coordinates on maps, the historical records, reinforced the undeniable reality of my claim, and as I gestured toward the section of land containing the HOA building, the realization that Margaret had encroached on my property became apparent to everyone present. The officers nodded again, this time with a quiet authority, and I could sense that the tide of the encounter had shifted completely, the orchard standing as silent witness to the meticulous preparation, patience, and clarity that had transformed what could have been confrontation into recognition of rightful ownership. The gentle movement of the leaves, the warm light on my face, and the earthy scent of the soil all combined into a sensory affirmation that the land I had nurtured for years was firmly under my stewardship, and the balance of understanding had settled, leaving Margaret with no choice but to acknowledge the reality of the situation. The sunlight had shifted again, casting a golden hue across the orchard as I walked slowly between the rows, feeling the uneven soil beneath my boots and the textured bark of the trees I had tended for years. The faint scent of earth and blossoms filled the air, mingling with the distant aroma of cut grass from a neighboring field, grounding me in the reality of the land I had worked so hard to maintain. Margaret stood near the edge of the property, her posture tense, her polished shoes catching the light as she shifted weight from one foot to another, and I could sense the subtle hesitation in her movements, a silent acknowledgement that the facts I had presented were undeniable. The officers moved quietly among the trees, occasionally glancing at the documents and maps I had displayed, their expressions revealing growing recognition of the legal clarity I had established. I paused at the intersection of two boundary markers, running my hand along the weathered wood, tracing the lines physically as I described the historical significance and the continuity of ownership, each word deliberate and precise, harmonizing with the natural rhythm of the orchard around me. The breeze carried the soft hum of bees and the rustle of leaves, punctuated by the distant crow of a rooster, creating an almost cinematic soundtrack to the unfolding resolution. Margaret tried to speak, her voice low and measured, but the certainty in her tone lacked conviction, and I could see the subtle frown as she glanced at the corner of the orchard where her HOA building encroached upon my land, the truth becoming increasingly clear. I held up the latest set of survey maps, pointing to the plotted lines and recorded measurements, the sunlight making the ink shimmer and emphasizing the precision of the documentation, and I noticed the shift in the officer's stance, their attention fully attuned to the evidence before them. Each detail, the stakes marking the property, the annotated photographs, and the historical records, reinforced the legitimacy of my claim, and I could feel the quiet satisfaction of rightness growing within me. The orchard seemed to embrace the moment, the leaves swaying gently as if in silent applause, and the distant sounds of rural life blended seamlessly with the gravity of the scene. Margaret's expression softened slightly, the defiance replaced by a muted acceptance, and I understood that the balance had shifted irrevocably in my favor. I walked to the center of the orchard, feeling the subtle slopes and furrows beneath my feet, inhaling deeply the mixture of soil, blossoms, and fresh spring air, and allowed a calm sense of triumph to settle over me. Every measured step and deliberate gesture had brought the situation to this point, and as I looked across the orchard, the officers, and Margaret, I realized that patience, preparation, and unwavering attention to detail had transformed confrontation into acknowledgement. The afternoon sunlight highlighted the vibrant green of the leaves, the gentle sway of the branches mirrored the quiet resolution, and the entire scene carried the unmistakable weight of justice realized and ownership firmly reclaimed. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a warm amber glow over the orchard, turning the leaves into shimmering patches of gold and green. I moved deliberately between the rows of apple trees, feeling the familiar grooves in the soil under my boots, and the texture of bark beneath my fingertips, each touch a reminder of the years of care and patience invested in this land. Margaret stood silently at the edge, her posture taut yet restrained, and I could sense the subtle shift in her demeanor, the pride and entitlement that had carried her through previous confrontations now tempered by the undeniable clarity of the situation. The officers, having reviewed every map, survey, and documented record I had laid before them, stood with measured attention, their eyes scanning the landscape and the papers with a growing acknowledgement of my rightful ownership. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead, carrying with it the mingling scents of blossoms, fresh earth, and the faint trace of asphalt from the road beyond the orchard, creating a sensory backdrop that contrasted with the tension that had dominated the morning hours. I paused near a corner where the property curved around the HOA building, lifting the latest set of photographic evidence and pointing out the clearly marked boundaries, explaining with calm precision the history and continuity of possession that had been meticulously maintained over time. Margaret's gaze dropped to the stakes marking the edge of the property, her previous confidence now replaced with hesitation, the subtle tightening of her jaw and the slight furrow of her brow betraying the realization that her assertions were no longer sustainable. The orchard itself seemed to respond, the leaves rustling softly as if echoing the validation of my claims, the bees continuing their diligent work among the blossoms, and a distant crow marking the passage of time in its sharp, solitary call. I walked slowly along the central path, feeling the slight incline underfoot, inhaling the crisp spring air mingled with the earthy aroma of the orchard, and allowed the presence of tangible evidence, measured preparation, and unwavering attention to detail to resonate through the scene. Every map, survey, and document reinforced the reality of ownership, and the officers nodded subtly as they took in the cumulative weight of the proof, their movements deliberate yet unhurried, signaling recognition. Without need for verbal affirmation. Margaret's posture relaxed incrementally, a silent concession forming as she glanced once more at the corner of the orchard that encompassed the HOA property, her eyes briefly meeting mine with an unspoken acknowledgement of the truth. The golden light highlighted the leaves and the contours of the orchard floor, the soft hum of insects and rustle of branches creating an almost tangible sense of peace, and I felt a profound satisfaction as the culmination of patience, diligence, and careful preparation transformed the confrontation into quiet recognition. The land beneath my feet, the trees I had nurtured, and the carefully documented boundaries all stood as witnesses to the shift, a reminder that steadfast commitment and clarity of purpose had restored balance, and the orchard, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon, resonated with the quiet triumph of rightful ownership now indisputable. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long, warm streaks of light across the orchard and illuminating every leaf and branch with a golden glow. I walked through the rows, feeling the textured bark of the apple trees beneath my fingertips and the uneven soil giving softly under my boots, each step a quiet reminder of the years I had invested in cultivating this land. The scent of fresh earth mingled with the faint sweetness of blossoms and the lingering aroma of distant grass clippings, forming a tapestry of scents that was uniquely tied to the orchard itself. Margaret remained near the edge, her posture slightly slumped, the tension in her shoulders eased but the acknowledgement in her gaze unmistakable as she surveyed the clearly marked stakes and the precise lines of the property that had been confirmed by legal documentation. The officers moved quietly through the orchard, consulting the maps and records one last time, nodding subtly to one another as they confirmed the boundaries and ownership that had been painstakingly established. I stopped at a small cluster of trees in the center of the orchard, brushing my gloved hand over the bark and inhaling deeply, the crisp spring air filling my lungs and carrying with it a sense of quiet triumph and satisfaction. The wind stirred the leaves overhead, creating a soft rustling that harmonized with the distant calls of birds and the hum of bees among the blossoms, a natural soundtrack that mirrored the resolution taking place. I lifted the folder of documents one final time, showing the officers the comprehensive surveys, photographs, and notarized deeds that validated every statement I had made, each page catching the warm light and shining with clarity. Margaret shifted her gaze toward the corner of the property that included her HOA building, her expression a mix of reluctant acceptance and reflection, and I recognized the subtle but undeniable understanding that the land she had assumed control over was indeed mine. The orchard seemed to breathe around us, the gentle sway of branches and the soft, golden light creating a sense of calm and affirmation that echoed the satisfaction within me. I walked slowly to the far edge of the property, feeling the gentle slope and the firm soil beneath my feet, observing the neat rows of trees and the stakes marking each boundary, knowing that every detail I had cultivated, documented, and defended now stood as irrefutable evidence of rightful ownership. The soft sounds of rural life, the distant tractor, the chirping birds, and the rustling leaves, blended seamlessly with the peaceful ambience of the orchard, reinforcing the finality of the day's events. I took a deep breath, letting the warm sunlight and fresh air fill me, and looked across the orchard at the officers and Margaret, sensing that the confrontation had transformed into a quiet acknowledgement of truth and justice. Every step, every documented survey, every carefully tended tree had led to this moment, and as the light shifted into the softer hues of late afternoon, I felt the orchard itself stand as a silent witness to the perseverance, preparation, and patient resolve that had restored balance and affirmed the ownership that was rightfully mine.